what is it like to live in your body in a context of extreme inequality if you're living in an informal settlement and you have needs and all these other functions you have to perform in that role. What is it like to be you in that context? And where you are daily confronted by the fact that this is not everybody's reality, that it's possible for this reality to be different. And yet you still have to, you're trapped in your own life. You're not able to come out of it.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Equals, the super brilliant, fantastic podcast about inequality. I'm Max.
And I'm Graziele. And I have a question for you, listeners. What does inequality actually feel like in your body? Not just in data, not in graphics, but in your daily life, in the way that you breathe, how your heart beats, your stress levels, your daily decisions, your chances of living well.
In this episode, we're going to look at that human impact of inequality. And in particular, we're going to speak with Dr. Wanga Zembe, and she's a member of the founding committee that's putting together this new international panel on inequality, which we had an episode about already. And what we're going to talk to her about is many things, but the important need to kind of humanize the kind of statistics and data on inequality to show that inequality is not just a development issue either, but a global emergency. And that's why we need a new international panel on inequality. It's going to be fun to talk to her.
It will. Let's listen.
Wanga, thank you so much for joining us on Equals. I've had the pleasure of working with you over the last year on this exciting inequality business. So it's really good to talk to you about it here. But before that, just to introduce a bit, you've had a fascinating career. You've researched so much around poverty, health, inequality. And I know from all your inputs to the process how much you care about that and the relationship between the policies of government and tackling inequality. So it's really good to get into this with you. But perhaps you could tell us, what is this kind of thread that runs through all of your work and your research, and what brought you to the place you are today?
Thank you so much. Thanks, Max. And thank you for having me on this important podcast. So I would say my work has really sought to answer two central questions. So that's, the common thread in any research study that I've conducted, in any project I've worked on. The running thread in terms of those two questions is one, wanting to understand in a very deep and meaningful way that goes beyond numbers, what the experience and impact of poverty and inequality is on the everyday life of people who are affected by those two ills. And then wanting to understand that, as I say, at a deeper level, so at a very micro level, the day-to-day experiences, seeking to understand what is it like to live in your body in a context of extreme inequality if you're living in an informal settlement and you have needs, you have people depending on you in the case of caregivers or mothers having children depend on them, and all these other functions you have to perform in that role. What is it like to be you in that context? And where you are daily confronted by the fact that this is not everybody's reality, that it's possible for this reality to be different. And yet you still have to, you're trapped in your own life. You're not able to come out of it. So trying to capture that in a very granular way. And, so I call my work, I talk about it as a way, it's humanizing the data, the numbers. It's bringing the human aspect to that. And then connecting it with macro level decisions and just the environment, how it's shaped, how it's structured in terms of its response to what's happening at this micro level. And then very specifically looking at how, government policies, and then specifically because I look at social determinants of health. So often my studies are looking at the impact from a standpoint of how those conditions that people are born in, so the inequality, the poverty, how it then impacts on their health and well-being. And then also the connection with that macro level is seeking to understand what people think, the people who are affected, that low-income mother living in that informal settlement, the patient with TB who has nothing to eat, in fact, whose life and the way in which it's organized is what put them at risk of contracting the TB in the first place, and is also what makes it very difficult for them to recover and thrive post the TB infection. So seeking to understand what they then think of what's happening at that macro space. So what are their feelings about their government or governments, what's being done, the efforts that are being done, and how, so I've done studies that look at how people feel seen by they have visibility, which essentially the findings are, often that they feel invisible, and how they feel and conceptualize social rights of citizenship, and especially in a context like ours with the history of apartheid, which very much explains the extreme inequality that we see and really stubborn poverty and just structural failures that we see. So I would say that's the common thread in anything that I'm doing. You will see that attempt to understand.
I just find it so fascinating, this link that you make, and that's quite unique to bring the perspective of embodied inequality, how people live inequality in their, not just their lives, their community, but in their bodies. This is quite unique. So thank you for bringing that. And I was wondering, on this amazing working and research experience you have, how do you believe this led you to be one of the founding committee members of the International Panel on Inequality?
Thank you, Graciela. So I think it is precisely because of the uniqueness of my position on inequality. I think that's what got me involved. I think when I was invited, what I was told was we need someone who's going to bring the perspective from the ground of what inequality is and how it affects people's lives.
And what comes next in this process?
So last year, the 6 of us who were then selected to be part of what was then called the Extraordinary Committee of Experts on Inequality, quite a mouthful. What we were tasked with was to, in a relatively short time, write up this report that would synthesize the evidence that, is available across the world on inequality, on its drivers, its consequences, and then make policy recommendations. So we did that as part of South Africa's G20 presidency from 2024 to 2025. So having done that, and it was received extremely well. I mean, the report, the main message that we wanted to give, which people really got, and by people I mean decision makers, actors at every level. The message we wanted to communicate was this is an inequality emergency, and so they got that. But it then became very clear, even as we were writing, that this would have to be followed up on. And certainly we can't have an emergency that's going to stop with a short little report as part of the G20. So then now we are now setting up this International Panel on Inequality as a way of ensuring that this work continues, the work of measuring, documenting, analyzing, and then describing and synthesizing this evidence on inequality, that this structure gets established and is able to provide that information periodically in the same way as the International Panel on Climate Change has done, and feed into, hopefully, policy decision-making processes in that way, and just provide current, trustworthy, reliable information in a periodic way, on what inequality is, what the trends are, where it's at, what progress is being made, and what needs to be done in terms of recommendations.
So to building on that, one of the things, the last two answers you made, I mean, your particular perspective on this, and particularly not just you, but others throughout the process of preparing the report last year and the recommendations, was to make sure that this isn't just a series of economists talking about kind of economic data, that it is, but that doesn't necessarily mean it stops being scientific. There's an element of kind of multidisciplinarity and seriousness about the humanity and the human impact of inequality. That how can we see that come across in this proposed panel as well? What would be your dream outcome when we see our first panel report in terms of your particular perspective on inequality?
It would precisely be my dream outcome of the International Panel on Inequality, that the panel itself would be representative, would be multidisciplinary, and, so would represent different perspectives, and not sort of individual perspectives on inequality, but different scientific perspectives, and coming at inequality from different levels. So I'm a social policy practitioner. I come at it from a very different place than an economist would. And it's wanting to see that plurality of methods, of conceptualizing, of measuring. Of course, the only criteria we have is that it needs to be rigorous, properly, so scientific work, but can come in different forms and ways, certainly in terms of methods. So for instance, that we will use multiple sources, for the data that we then synthesize, that, it won't just be quantitative, numbers and statistics, but that it will also bring in, that's my very big hope, bring the actual voices, case studies, and what are people saying on the ground? How are they saying they are being impacted by inequality? But of course, done and measured in a scientific way that speaks to established, trusted scientific methods that we use in academia and in research.
And one area that overlaps with all of this, and I think would be interesting for listeners, is around the social determinants of health, isn't it? And the relationship between kind of income gradients and health outcomes. And can you say a little bit about the science around that? Because that's more epidemiology, isn't it? But it's still very scientific and very kind of well-researched and established. And perhaps it'd be good for readers to understand that kind of area of work and how that relates back to inequality.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic, really. So social determinants of health as a framework first came out probably nearly 20 years ago. I mean, you would have seen it in different iterations, not called the social determinants of health, but essentially the period in which we were able to capture that as a concept, which has now become accepted, and would have been about 20 years ago. And what it sought to do was to move away from, first of all, thinking about health as illness in the body at a moment in time. It was to understand that long before the person gets ill, where they come from, the conditions they were born in and they continue to make a life in, that they live in, will absolutely determine, A, that they get sick at all, and then having been sick and ill, whether they recover and how they recover. Because that, of course, then links to access issues. Are they able to access quality health care? And then some of what I've done in my studies, looking at once the person has left their health system, when looking at TB, what happens when they get home? What is it that happens? What determinants are at the household and community level that we can use to reliably predict that that person will be back in the health system with a recurring infection, with TB again, right? Or something else. And so epidemiology, of course, has made it so easy to be able to clearly map those relationships, and fundamentally the relationship between what happens outside the health system and how that impacts on people's lives. But also it's taking on the WHO definition of health, which is that it's more than absence of infirmity in the physical body. It's someone who is well in every sense of the word. It speaks to well-being. They are well mentally, they are well physically in their bodies. They feel like they are functioning at their best. And with physical illness, but also poor well-being will disrupt that, will affect the extent to which a person can say, I am well. And how we understand what's happening structurally outside the health system, that's what social determinants of health is. And when we use that framework in and outside health to design policies and responses that ensure that, first of all, everyone can say, I am well in the WHO sense of that definition. I'm well physically, mentally, financially, in every way, I am well. That then we will have absence of, or if not absence, we will have much lower levels. So countries who've been able to achieve this, the Scandinavian model, for instance, the rate of illness and the types of illnesses they get, the diseases that you get, they are very different. And of course, they have a much lower, in general, illness burden. And then how people do on the other matrix, on mental health, on other ways in which we measure well-being and health, you can see that when the state has provided that foundation for people to thrive, that they do thrive, and then they can say they are healthy. So the social determinants of health, when you frame it in that way, it's extremely powerful in not only understanding how inequality affects people, but also in how deliberate actions and choices that are made can actually change that picture entirely.
Yeah, and it really puts down the myth of meritocracy, right? Because if you are in such a different condition and with so many social determinants, it's impossible to say that people are on the same foot to have a merit on something.
We're able to see that because, in a sense, you're not able to use meritocracy, because what this says is that if the conditions in which people are born and then grow up and then live, if those are not correct, that person doesn't even have a chance to demonstrate if they are good enough for that one thing or the other. And also that's why, in a sense, equity becomes different from equality. It's so you don't just want to level the playing field, but you actually want to, in recognition of how those conditions that which people are born and grow and make a living, in recognition of the fact that those conditions are in a way predetermined for them. For the baby who is born today, they've not had a say in that, what situation they are born into. And because of that, with equity, you are then saying, so that baby is going to need a slightly different approach in helping them to get to the level playing field where they can then compete with the baby born in a high income suburb with, with everything that they need and want. That essentially, that's how it shoots down that theory.
Absolutely. And let me go back to the International Panel on Inequality. In the last episode that we interviewed Isabel and Kati, and they told us about the governments that are very supportive of this initiative. But please tell us, who were the ones that were being more opposite to it?
I don't know if we've had any outright opposition. I don't think we have. Reception has generally been enthusiastic and supportive, but we have had countries that have sought additional information.
I mean, obviously, if we can get this international panel on inequality, it would be a big shift, a pioneering shift. And as you put it earlier on, we could really get to the point where there is consensus over the inequality emergency, and then it normalizes the need for governments to tackle it. But to kind of bring that a bit closer to home and to people on the ground and people really on the sharp end of the impacts of inequality, how do you think this panel, what could it really mean to them? How could they get excited about it? Why should they care that this thing is happening? It feels a bit kind of esoteric, and I mean, it's not the usual thing that our listeners would probably get excited about. So I think it's really important to hear from you and from others why it matters.
Yeah, I think it's because, so we know from the evidence that we have that for the longest time, the belief was that we didn't have to worry about inequality. First of all, the inevitability of it, but also the trickle-down theory that you sort of need it actually if you want to solve other things like poverty. But of course, now we know that it is. And I think, and there was already an awareness that has started in academia, I think in the world in general. So when the rankings on inequality have been published and my country, South Africa, being at the top of that list, I remember having such discussions at university, different contexts, about the fact that this is not a good thing. But I think reports and initiatives such as last year's inequality report that we did, and then now what we're planning to do, what it does is to not only affirm that sense that inequality is actually important for development, for growth, for the flourishing of society and individuals within that society, addressing it is important for achieving that. And understanding what it is important for being able to achieve that. And so that report that we did was, then really added in a big way. And the fact that it brought to the fore, the fact that it's not just a problem, it's an emergency problem. It's at the level of an emergency. It's the inequality emergency means that it's changing. So a lot of people keep referring to make the link with climate change that, so in similar ways, started off as something that there were some people who were aware that it's sort of a problem, but there was a huge amount, of people who thought that doesn't even exist as an issue, right? We went through that. And then slowly, well, maybe it could be, but it could not. There wasn't anything that people could anchor their understanding and their thinking about it around until the IPCC was formed. And then when it began to bring out those reports, which were scientific, which were objective, which you couldn't argue with, then everyone was like, oh no, we are in big trouble. So in the same way with inequality, the report started us off last year saying, this is an emergency, world, wake up. And the IPI, which is why we absolutely have to set it up, would then be able to keep not that just that momentum, but in producing those periodic reports and reporting on what is going on with inequality in a way that is objective, scientific, trustworthy, where people can trust their science. Then it will also become something that's generally understood by everyone that A, it's real, B, it's a big problem. And so we need to do something about it. That's really what makes it so critical for us to establish and for people to get behind it and to know that it's important because inequality affects everyone. In fact, as we reported in our report, it doesn't just affect the ones who are on the opposite end of that spectrum, the ones who suffer negative consequences of inequality, but it actually even affects those who are on the upper end of that spectrum. So the wealthy, the rich, it makes their own existence uncertain. And certainly the ability to flourish and for the world to be a place where they continue to make good money if that's what they want, that gets threatened, because then people are not able to trust governments and institutions. And also you get to a point where you have too few people having too much and the majority having nothing. Which society can survive with that? It's not sustainable.
Yeah, I agree. And also coming back to your field, it's also true that I think that rich people are more healthy in more equal societies, and they live longer too. That even the richest are impacted health-wise in a very unequal society where you might have higher levels of crime or insecurity, and it's in the interest of all rich people to live in more equal societies, definitely, even though they might not realize it.
So I really like how you frame this by saying that with the report, you were able to say very clearly, like, inequality is an emergency and we need to act now. And then after that, you have already had one meeting in Geneva, and you're going to have another meeting in a few days in South Africa. So I'm willing to know more about the process. How is this process going? What is the expectation with this next meeting?
Thank you, Graciela. So later this week, we have our first convening actually in South Africa, or within Africa, for this new IPI. So it's the first time that we are all gathering together as the founding committee, and then invited experts in academia mainly, but we'll also have policy representatives, and we are all coming together to now really fine-tune the setting up of that committee. We are putting together the work streams that the international panel would establish, the governance system that we are going to have, and getting consensus on each of those areas, so the governance, the work streams, and then drilling down to how is this going to work? How is the IPI being formulated, and how will it carry out its functions? What those functions will be, and how will it carry those out? All of this in the run-up to us seeking and getting a UN resolution. So I would say that's the exciting thing that's happening later this week, and we will have President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, coming in to give us a keynote address as a way of sort of setting the scene for this group of people who are going to be working together to essentially, really entrench now the IPI as a structure, set it up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you a million times over.
That was quite an interesting interview, and it also brings hope about this new IPI. What stayed with me from this conversation is the idea that inequality is not something abstract, but it's lived in every single day, in everything that we do. And that changes everything about the way we think on solutions. Because if inequality is embodied, then policy isn't just technical, it's deeply human. And for you, what stood out, Max?
I think the same thing. Grazie Wanga, she's such a brilliant communicator, and she really brings the lived reality of ordinary people in South Africa that she works with into the room. And, I think for me, the strongest example of the kind of human face of inequality is it's not about having more money or a bigger house. Richer people live longer. Here in London, studies have shown that between the poorest area of London and the richest area is probably a distance of 3 or 4 miles. And the life expectancy is something like 10 or 12 years greater in the richer areas. So the human face of inequality is you get 12 years more life. I mean, that's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah. And here in Brazil, in São Paulo, life expectancy for the rich ones is 79, and for the poorest ones is 54. So
so the same thing. I do think Wanga was brilliant at bringing that kind of human reality here. And if the IPI does anything, it has to do that, doesn't it? Because it's a very important way to draw attention to the scale of the inequality emergency. It is what it means for everyday life and for everyday people. So that was great. Yeah, it's a great interview.
It was. And if this episode made you think different about inequality, if you want to promote changes to, like it, share it. You can find us on equals.inc, on social medias at Equals Hope, and in your favorite podcast player.
Yes, definitely. Stay in touch. And on this critical issue of the international panel, I mean, as Wanga said, there's a very, very important meeting coming up at the end of the week in Johannesburg. All of the world's inequality experts coming together with founding governments, and South African president is speaking. So I think this panel thing, I mean, maybe I'm biased, but I really think it's going to happen. So we'll keep listeners updated. We'll come back to it later in the year. And for now, keep listening to Equals and be in touch soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.